with me. Let's take a ride. Welcome to La Habana. This is from the Sanctioned Seat. Most everyday conversations about sanctions have very little to do with sanctions themselves. They have to do with politics, with power, with ideologies. But they're very little about actual sanctions. And sanctions, at the end of the day, are laws. They are laws that create economic changes in order to have political influences. I want this series, From the Sanction Seat, to be specifically a conversation about sanctions, about how sanctions work and who they affect. I comply with sanctions every day in my work. I live within the sanctions, I live within compliance, I document them, and I watch every day how profoundly misunderstood they are. In this series, I want to dedicate this conversation to talking about and unpackaging U.S. sanctions on Cuba so that we can better understand legal travel to Cuba. So welcome with me. This is From the Sanctions Seat. My name is Melisa Rivière. I'm an anthropologist and a certified sanctions specialist. I'm also the founder and director of Son Dos Alas, an agency dedicated to educational travel. For me, sanctions are not theoretical, they're operational. They define who can move, how money flows, what materials arrive, and what daily life looks like under their constraints. I call this the sanction seat because this is where compliance lives. Being in the sanction seat means occupying the spaces where sanctions are felt in ironic and oftentimes confusing ways. This series aims to explain U.S. sanctions, but from within the constraints, from within compliance, and to explain how sanctions shape legal travel to Cuba. What is permitted, what is restricted, what must be documented, and by whom. So, we decided to film this series from these 1950s American classic cars that Cuba is known for. They're not just nostalgic props, they are the evidence of U.S. sanctions on Cuba. If the United States sanctions did not exist, these cars wouldn't dominate Cuban roads. And a fun fact, there's about 70 to 75,000 of these cars still on the roads today throughout the island of Cuba. If there was no sanctions from the United States on Cuba, these cars would have easily have been replaced by modern supply chain and by newer models. But instead, they remain. And they remain as evidence of US policy on Cuba. Because sanctions restrict trade, because parts are unavailable, because replacement becomes impossible. So they've also become a symbol of ingenuity here in Cuba, of how Cubans have been able to fabricate parts when they couldn't ship them, fabricate and make parts from other machines in order to keep these cars working on the roads today. What can't be imported must be invented. These cars, like I said, are not just symbols of the past. They are the moving records. They are the evidence of US policy. US sanctions on Cuba are often described as if they appeared fully formed all at once, but they didn't. Their foundation comes from the Trading with the Enemy Act, a law that was passed in 1917 under the Woodrow Wilson administration. That was during World War I. That law gives the United States government authority, blanket authority, to restrict economic trade and any kind of activity with designated nations, countries that during times of war were considered national emergencies. Cuba entered this framework in 1963 after the Cuban Revolution and the confrontation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Under this justification, the Cuba Assets Control Regulations were established as part of the Trading with the Enemy Act. What matters today is this. Cuba is the only country that still remains under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Back then, it included Germany, Italy, Japan, North Korea. Today, all of those sanctions have moved on to other sanctions regimes, which are much more modernized and specific. Most U.S. sanctions today are under a law that was passed in 1977 under the Carter administration. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEPA. IEPA allows the president to regulate economic activity after declaring a national emergency. It's flexible, it's renewable, and it's designed for modern sanctions regimes. IEPA is a peacetime act that lets the president impose targeted, flexible sanctions in response to declared national emergencies, usually aimed at specific governments, market sectors, entities, or individuals rather than blanket countries. Let's take, for example, the just recent January 29th executive order under the Trump administration. That was an order that was placed under the IEPA Act so that if United States wants to, they have the framework now to place sanctions on third countries that trade oil to Cuba. But why is that under IEPA? Because it's not directed at Cuba. It's directed at third countries, and it's flexible, it's targeted, and it only sanctions the fuel or the energy market. It's very specific, and that's what makes IEPA very different than TWIA, where TWIA sanctions Cuba as a country as a broad sanction over all of Cuba. Because Cuba sanctions were made rooted in TWIA, they operate under an older, more rigid statutory structure. Over time, executive orders and regulatory adjustments have been layered on top of each other, but the foundation never changed. So when people talk about the Cuba sanctions or the Cuba sanction, sometimes they mistakenly refer to one policy. But in reality, we're looking at various stacked architectures of laws, one on top of the other. You start with a 1917 World War I Act. On top of it is a Soviet Union US Cold War compounded layer of laws from 1963 onward. On top of that, these all get administered by the Department of the Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control. And later, presidential decrees determined by various administrations are then selectively placed on top of these other layers. So you're looking at not one system, not one law. You're looking at an architecture of laws and systems that reflect different years and different US administrations. Those are the ones we have to continue to operate in today. One of the most consistent myths is that the US citizens are not allowed to travel to Cuba. And that is not how the law works. The travel itself is not illegal. Legal travel to Cuba exists inside the sanctions system. It's structured, it's regulated, but it is not banned. Confusion around this point is what drives a lot of fear and a lot of misinformation way out of proportion of what is the actual legal risk. That's why this series is developed, because I think it's important that we better understand the legal foundations of legal travel to Cuba and the legal foundations of Cuba sanctions, that we understand how TWIA and IEPA actually work and what they do with respect to legal travel to Cuba. This series is about how the system works, how the legal foundations of Cuba sanctions function, what TWIA and IEPA actually mean and what they do with respect to legal travel to Cuba, who the players are, how compliance functions, and why confusion persists. I'm not here to argue ideology. I'm here rather to break down what are the relevant parts of legal travel to Cuba so that we can understand this without sensationalism and neither with romanticism. So now we understand that sanctions are infrastructure. They're legal infrastructure. And once you understand the legal infrastructure, you can begin to better understand legal travel to Cuba. That's the purpose of this series, to slow down the noise, to break down the parts, to explain the machinery, and to better understand legal travel to Cuba, and to speak calmly from inside the sanctioned seat. What's your key takeaways from today? One, that legal travel to Cuba is permitted. And two, well, that you should do it with us. Come to Cuba with Son Dos Alas. Dime, cuéntame un poquito de este carro. Dame el modelo, el año y cuéntame qué es lo que lo distingue.
Bueno, este carro es un Chevrolet del año 58, Chevrolet vizcaíno. En ese año se construyeron tres coches como estos. El Junior, que solo tenía un foco detrás, se construyó el vizcaíno, que tiene dos focos, y se construyó el Impala, que tiene tres focos. Casi no cambia en nada, solamente en los focos.
Y este es el que tiene los dos focos.
Este tiene dos focos, es vizcaíno, y el Impala tiene tres.
¿Hace cuánto que tienes este carro?
Hace aproximadamente 4 años que tengo este coche. Es un coche que ya no tiene su motor original. El producto al combustible hubo que cambiarlo. Entonces, solamente el motor es el que no es original. Todo lo demás es original del coche.
¿Este coche original era diésel o era...?
No, era gasolina.
Era gasolina. Sí. ¿Y usted lo cambió?
Sí, hubo que cambiarlo por un Hyundai.
¿Podemos abrir el capó y sí, mirar adentro? Por favor. ¿Cuántas veces hay que repararlos? Mi gran pregunta, porque mucha gente piensa que estos siguen vivos.
Prácticamente cada 2 años lo paramos, le damos su mantenimiento en pintura, tapicería y después los coches sin techo lo cogemos para trabajar con el turismo.
Claro.
Vamos a ver el motor.
Vamos a ver el motor. A ver, cuéntame aquí. ¿Qué estamos viendo aquí?
Ya, aquí están viendo toda esta parte, lo que son originales del motor. Lo que no es el motor es el motor solamente, ¿sí? El radiador y la caja de velocidad. Todo lo demás, bomba de frenos, todo es original del carro.
Radiador, motor, ¿y qué otra cosa era?
Caja de velocidad.
Caja de velocidad. ¿Y qué son? ¿Cómo tuviste que empatar o sea, digamos, las piezas antiguas con piezas más modernas?
Simplemente hubo que sacar el motor original, adaptar los calzos de este motor al chasis, adaptar la caja a un chasis intermedio y después regular la transmisión. ¿Y
la transmisión es Hyundai también?
No, la transmisión es la original.
Es la original.
Sí.
¿El motor es?
Hyundai.
Y el
radiador Hyundai y la caja de velocidad Hyundai.
Y todo el resto viene siendo original
del,
del Chevrolet Biscayne.
Bueno.